Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're taking a look at the Topping E30 and L30 Mark II or version 2, whatever you want to call them. And I want to start off by saying a huge thanks to Appos for sending me these devices for review. As is always the case, even though these have been sent to me for free for review purposes, it doesn't influence what I'm going to say about them. And if you've watched any of my past reviews on various products sent to me by Appos, you'll know that there's sometimes good and sometimes not good reviews. And that's true for any products that I get sent like this. The E30 and the L30 version 2 are both priced exactly the same as each other, and that's at $149 US, meaning that this little stack beside me comes in at just $298 for a fully featured DAC, also headphone amp, and also preamp. And so if it performs well sonically, it obviously offers excellent value, and so that's what we're here to find out, and particularly to compare it to a few other competitors in the market in the form of the SMSL SU-6 and SH-6, the SMSL DO100 and HO100, and the bigger brother to the Topping 30 stack here, which is the E50 and L50 behind me, also from Topping. So let's dive in and see how the E30 and L30 version 2 compare to these others. Starting off with a quick introduction of these products, the E30 is the DAC here, and I'm referring to these from now on as the E30 and the L30, but they are both the version 2. The E30 offers you a pair of AK4493 DAC chips, so this is a return to the AKM chips in Toppings. And technically that's actually the AK4493S, I should say. That's a new version of the same chip, I believe. The E30 is generally a fairly simple DAC. There's not a huge amount to talk about. If you are looking at it just on its own, it does have volume control, or you can disable the volume control and move into pure DAC mode. What that's going to do is improve performance if you're running DSD into the E30. And in my testing, it does perform slightly better with DSD than PCM. And when you go to pure DAC mode, it gets a little bit better again with DSD. So it's a good feature to have there if you're someone that either upsamples to DSD or if you've got a DSD collection. And we'll talk more about DSD later, but let's continue now with a bit of talk about the specs and the design of the device. Looking at the front panel, the E30 is very simple. It's got this same glass panel as the original E30. You've got a single touch operated button over here, and that's going to control the power on off function and also cycle through your different modes. You can also long press it from standby to access some additional menu functions. And those extra menu functions are where you're going to switch on things like the pure DAC mode. And through that menu or the remote control, you can also change things like the auto on-off function, which filters are being used, all those sorts of bits and pieces. Speaking of filters, the E30 comes with the usual range, I think of 7 off the top of my head. And as always, they make subtle changes to the sound, but it's not like using an EQ where it's vastly going to change what you can hear. It's just going to make some subtle changes to the character of the sound of the DAC. The only other thing on this front panel is an orange backlit LED display. And that's going to show you things like sample rate, volume if you're changing the volume, and of course the source that's selected. If we flip around to the back of the device, on the back here we've got a pair of RCA outputs for your audio output. This is single-ended only. And then we've got a coaxial input, an optical input, and a USB-B input. While we're talking about the digital inputs, it's worth noting that your SPDIF inputs, that being the optical and the coaxial, will go up to 192 kHz and 24-bit. So if you do want to run DSD or any high sample rate PCM, you will need to use the USB socket. The final thing on the back here is a 5V DC power input, and Topping provide in the box a USB-A to DC barrel connector, and the idea of that is that you're either going to plug it in to a USB socket on your computer, which is not ideal because that can be quite noisy power, or you can go and grab a phone charger. Just a normal everyday phone charger is going to give you good performance. Or if you want to go all out, you can run a battery or linear power supply for even better sound still. For clarity for this review, I've done all my testing running from a basic phone power supply, because in my testing that I did way back when I reviewed the Topping P50 linear power supply, the biggest difference in performance is when you go from, say, a USB output to a phone charger, and then there are incremental gains going from, say, a phone charger to a battery source or a linear power supply. But a phone charger to me is the easiest and most cost-effective way of powering something like the E30, so that's what all my testing's been done with when we get to the sound quality. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. Putting down the E30 for a moment, and let's take a look at the L30. The L30 is your amplifier for this combo. It's a single-ended amplifier, and it's capable of outputting 1.7 watts into 32 ohms, which is a significant increase on the original L30. If you happen to be running high impedance headphones like say some ZMFs or some Sennheisers, you've still got 560 milliwatts coming from the L30 Mark II, and that's plenty. The amplification circuit in here uses Topping's own nested feedback system, so very similar to the THX approach. And that's all designed to get distortion very, very low, and sometimes works well for Topping, and at other times I find does get a little bit dry, a little bit boring and lifeless in the sound. And we will talk about that shortly with the L30, how I think it sounds as an amplifier on its own. The final things to mention here all come with a device tour, so let's take a quick look at that. Starting off over on the side here, we've got a power switch that's going to move from an off position through to a headphone amp position and a preamp position. So this is also a preamp. You can run the DAC as a preamp, or you can have the amp and use that as the preamp. And I like the fact that you've got a simple switch to jump between the two, so you can leave your headphones plugged in all the time and just flick the switch if you've got, say, powered monitors that you want to run. Next to the power switch, we've then got a gain switch. That's going to move through different gain levels from a minus 14 dB through to a 0 at medium and up to a 16.5 dB in high gain. We've got a single 6.3mm output because, as I said before, this is single-ended. And then, of course, your volume control, which has got a really nice smooth turning pot. There's a bit of resistance to it, and it generally feels good. Flipping to the back, and we've got a pair of RCA inputs, a pair of RCA outputs for the aforementioned preamp functionality, and then we've got another barrel style connector, but this time it's for 15 volt AC power. So don't go plugging in any kind of DC linear power supply or battery to this one. This uses alternating current. And that's something that was done on the previous L30. It's been done on some shit amps as well, like the Magni. And the idea of that is that by taking the alternating current supply outside the device, they can keep it nice and small, but still produce buckets of power. So make sure that you do stick to the supplied power supply with this one. Don't go trying to use linear power supplies because they might cause damage. Having completed the tour of the devices though, let's start talking about how they sound. And there's not a huge amount to say when it comes to a stack like this. The DAC performance is once again excellent. I say once again because I was impressed with the original E30 and even more so with the E50 behind me. The E30 Mark II or version 2 continues that trend by producing a really nice quality DAC at the price point. It's got a good tonality that's neither too cool or too warm, it's just very balanced and very natural. And the sense of imaging separation is really solid too. It doesn't produce a particularly large soundstage, but all the instruments are nicely separated and it gives you a clear sense of the music. The L30 version 2 amp is also really solid. It does come across just a tiny bit muted when compared to other amps, but that's in comparison. When I was using this on its own just to get to know the stack, I felt like I was missing absolutely nothing from the sound. So in isolation, it's a wonderful combination. But as you'll hear shortly, when you do start to get into comparisons with other higher quality amps, you do hear that you're getting what you're paying for here in the sense that you're getting a good amplifier, but it is still a budget amplifier. Going to a higher level amp can get you better sense of separation, better sense of clarity and attack on the notes. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with the L30 Mark II. As I said before though, there's not a huge amount to say about this in isolation. It's always hard to describe DACs and amps on their own, because without context, unless they're deeply flawed, there's really not much to say. They either do a good job or they don't do a good job. So unless they're deeply flawed and have a really striking tonal character or a really flat soundstage or something like that, there's not much to say, and I think it's better off for us to jump over and put them into context with the various competitors behind me. And so let's do that now, starting with the cheaper SU-6 and SH-6 stack. That's this little one over the back here. And I've got dedicated reviews of all of these on the channel. So if you want to check out any of these in more detail, do go and check out the standalone reviews of each of them. But for this comparison, I started off with the E30 and the L30 up against the SU-6 and SH-6. I was playing Helpless by John Mayer and I was listening via the Mezza 109 Pros. Now if you want to see a review of the 109 Pros, make sure you hit the subscribe button. That one's coming early next year. Flipping back and forth between the two stacks, what I immediately heard was that the topping stack does provide better sound. That extra bit of money that you're paying definitely pays off. Specifically, what I was hearing was a better sense of space in the sound. There was more separation of individual instruments. The soundstage came across a little bit larger as a result, and everything just sounded a little bit more detailed as well. The SMSL stack is still very good. It's a stack that I really, really like, particularly at the price. And some might prefer the way the SMSL stack produces a slightly thicker and fuller sound. But for me, you are getting better technicalities and not really any drawbacks in my opinion when you're using the E30 and the L30. And so I moved on fairly quickly from the SMSL 6 stack because for me, there's clearly a reason to spend a bit more on the Topping 30 stack. And so the question then came down to, what if you're willing to spend just a little bit more again and get something like the SMSL DO100 and HO100? As you can see over behind me, these are a little bit bigger than the E30 and the L30, so they are going to take up a little bit more space, but it potentially is also going to give you better sound. Flicking back and forth between the two different stacks using When the Party's Over by Billie Eilish. And what I heard was that the topping stack comes across a little bit flatter in the soundstage than the SMSL stack. So you're going to get a slightly flatter sound. You're also going to get all the sound coming a bit more forward to you. And what I mean by that is it's going to feel like you're sitting one seat or maybe two seats closer in the audience with the topping stack compared to the SMSL stack. And much like the previous comparison between the 30 stack and the 6 stack, what's happening here again is that the 30 stack is now the one that sounds just a little bit thicker and a little bit fuller. And that's going to be partly why it sounds a bit closer as well, is because there's a bit more weight to the sound. And that can be for better or worse. I think overall there's a bit of a trade-off here, where you're getting a slightly thicker and richer sound from the topping stack, whereas the SMSL 100 stack is giving you a little bit more detail and resolution in the sound. And so if you're running PCM and you just want the best possible sound and you've got the budget for any of these so far, then the SMSL 100 stack is the better choice by a moderate margin. I wouldn't say it's a huge gap. It's a small gap, but it's a noticeable gap. That said, if you're going to be running DSD, so if you're going to be, say, upsampling through Roon, where you've got a significant DSD library, what I found was that when I fed both stacks DSD and I had the E30 in that pure DAC mode, in that situation, the difference was pretty much negligible. I did still hear differences between the two, but it wasn't at a point where I would say one is better than the other, so much as they're just a little bit different. So with regular PCM playback, if you're not upsampling and say you're streaming from Cobas or Tidal, or you've got a Redbook CD collection that's been ripped or direct from CD, in those situations, I do think the 100 stack is a little bit better for the money. But if you're going to be running DSD, it becomes a bit harder to choose. And so I'll let you work out which one's better for you in terms of whether you're going to be running PCM or DSD, and then of course the size of them as well, and then move on to the final comparison with Topping's own E50 and L50. So essentially we've got the little brother or sister and the bigger brother or sister. For this test I was using Hose Kitchen by Michael Spivey, and still using the 109 Pros as the headphone. Going back and forth between the two here, it became really obvious why you'd spend the extra money on getting the E50 L50. They are basically an identical tonality, so you can very much hear that they've both come out of Topping, but everything's just improved on the 50 stack. You've got a greater sense of space, a greater sense of resolution, but everything's being done with identical tonality. And so for me, what this is telling us is that Topping have produced another excellent combo here. We're kind of spoilt for choice when you look at all the options on my desk. You can step up in little incremental jumps of budget, and each step you take, you are getting slightly better sound. So for me, it really comes down to exactly how much budget you've got and which form factor you might prefer. There are arguments for all of these, none of them are bad in any way, shape or form, and so the E30 and the L30 Mark II slot in perfectly to kind of the hierarchy here. They cost a bit more than the 6 stack from SMSL, a bit less than the 100 stack from SMSL, and they perform right in between the two. Before I wrap up, I should mention what I alluded to before, and that is that when you look at these in isolation as just an amp and just a DAC, I think both of them are also really good once again. There's nothing around the price point that I would say is clearly better as a DAC or better as an amp. There are certainly other choices around, and so what I would say is that if you're in the market for a DAC or a headphone amp or a stack, the E30 and the L30 Mark II should absolutely be on your list to check out. At $149, I think they represent excellent value. I'll be curious to see how they compare to the brand new Shit Magni and Modi. I've got those coming soon, that's the Plus versions. And so again, make sure you subscribe if you want to see how the Chinese gear here compares to the American gear coming from Shit. But for now, let me close this off by saying that I think the E30 and the L30 are a really solid and good option within that budget range. For under $300, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to do much better than what you get here. And so hopefully I've been able to provide some helpful comparisons for you, put these into context with the rest of the options on the market, at least from the Chi-Fi point of view. And as always, if you have found the review useful or helpful, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave with the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.